Varios jóvenes eran asesinados a sangre fría. El asesino atacaba de forma inesperada. Sus ataques no eran provocados. Su única motivación era el odio racial. Y después de matarlos, desaparecía. La formación era prometedora, ya que el auto estaba estacionado cerca de donde habían encontrado las huellas de los neumáticos. Dos días después de los asesinatos, la policía no parecía estar muy cerca de resolverlo. La cobertura en la prensa se intensificó y la indignación de la comunidad aumentó.
Nunca habíamos tenido un homicidio similar en Salt Lake City. Nunca antes habían disparado contra personas, en especial jóvenes muertos a balazos a mitad de una intersección. Todos querían información sobre los asesinatos, querían saber si se relacionaban con la raza.
Como existía una posible violación a los derechos civiles, la preocupación creció en el Departamento de Justicia. Se designó al fiscal federal adjunto Steve Snarr para supervisar el caso.
Los miembros de la comunidad negra estaban muy preocupados y se preguntaban si eso tenía una motivación racial, pero en ese momento no había respuestas claras.
El agente especial del FBI, Curtis Jensen, de la oficina de Salt Lake City, fue asignado para apoyar a los investigadores del lugar.
La primera vez que escuché sobre este caso me indigné. Causó una gran preocupación no solo entre la comunidad negra, sino sobre toda la comunidad y la ciudad de Salt Lake City. Sintieron que había un asesino suelto y que podría volver a suceder.
A medida que crecía la presión de la comunidad, los resultados de las pruebas del laboratorio de balística del FBI en Washington, D.C. ofrecieron a los investigadores una nueva pista. Los examinadores determinaron que el arma usada había sido un rifle de 6 tiros, quizás un Marlin o un Greenfield 30-30. Luego de ubicar tiendas de armas y anuncios clasificados de compras recientes, los investigadores dieron con 150 armas que coincidían con la descripción. Las probaron todas. La dirección que Hackman indicó estaba en Kentucky.
Hicimos que el FBI cotejara el nombre a través de su base de datos. No tenían nada con ese nombre, así que estábamos casi seguros de que lo que él había escrito en esa ficha era falso.
Los laboratorios del FBI en Washington, D.C. ubicaron tarjetas de huellas dactilares archivadas, pero no encontraron ninguna. También analizaron la caligrafía de Hackman y notaron unas características únicas que facilitarían su identificación. No tenían pruebas de que él fuera el asesino, pero eso era la única pista que tenían. Era una posibilidad remota, pero un equipo de 20 detectives se dispersó para buscar en otros moteles en el área. Llevaban copias de la tarjeta que Hackman llenó en el Regal Inn, esperando que coincidieran con su letra, por si usaba un alias diferente. El agente Jensen recuerda la búsqueda exhaustiva.
Se hizo la búsqueda en todas las habitaciones de moteles, desde Ogden, 50 kilómetros al norte de Salt Lake, hasta Provo, 50 kilómetros al sur, y se localizaron unos 8 moteles donde este sujeto se había alojado, usando nombres falsos, cada uno diferente, direcciones falsas y números de matrícula falsos para su auto.
Los investigadores del lugar también descubrieron que el sospechoso se había quedado en el motel Scenic el 20 de agosto, el día de los asesinatos. Estaba a 9 cuadras de los tiroteos en Liberty Park. Aunque Hackman se registró con nombres diferentes en cada motel, los laboratorios del FBI confirmaron que la caligrafía era la misma. Una de las fichas reveló una huella digital. Pero una revisión en la base de datos nacional de huellas dactilares no arrojó nada.
¿Este es uno de los registros de su motel?
En el motel Sandman encontraron otra pista.
Unas preguntas.
Los detectives descubrieron que en su tarjeta de registro declaró un Camaro con su número de matrícula.
Bien, aquí veo un número de matrícula.
Pero el propietario del motel había escrito un segundo número de matrícula a un lado.
Ese número era el número correcto.
Debía tener más de 70 años, quizás 80. Salía todas las madrugadas a eso de las 3 de la mañana con todas las hojas del registro del motel y pasaba junto a todos los autos para comprobar los números de matrícula contra sus tarjetas porque estaba seguro de que sus huéspedes se robarían una almohada o una toalla.
Cuando el propietario cotejó las placas del Camaro de Hackman con su ficha, los números no coincidían. Así que escribió los números correctos de Kentucky en el margen de la tarjeta. Una búsqueda en los registros reveló que la matrícula y el Camaro pertenecían a un miembro de una familia prominente de Louisville, Kentucky. Los detectives de Salt Lake City compartieron su hallazgo con los detectives en Cincinnati.
Sí, soy Mac O'Brien. ¿Cómo está?
De inmediato respondieron a Louisville y contactaron a la agencia policial allí y rastrearon al propietario real, registrado de este auto. De hecho, él había vendido su auto a otra persona unos meses antes.
El hombre de Louisville mostró a los detectives el recibo de venta. La policía anotó el nombre del comprador, el kilometraje del auto y su marca de neumáticos. Pero los problemas no habían terminado. El comprador había usado un nombre falso. El vendedor trabajó con un dibujante de la policía para hacer un retrato del comprador, un hombre blanco esbelto con acento de Kentucky.
Sí, creo que así es.
También en Salt Lake City, Mickey y su compañera hicieron para los detectives un retrato hablado del hombre que se hacía llamar Hackman.
Al mismo tiempo me reuní con Mickey, la prostituta a tiempo parcial, y su compañera de cuarto. Esta en realidad era una artista, una joven estudiante de arte, e hizo un retrato a mano alzada para empezar. Luego le preguntamos si podía trabajar con nuestro dibujante y lo hizo, y juntos realizaron un retrato de este hombre.
Hola Ron, ¿cómo te va? Bien, ¿y a ti? Muy bien. ¿Qué encontraste?
Cuando el retrato hablado llegó de Louisville a Utah, los detectives compararon las dos imágenes.
Hola, ¿cómo están?
Buenos días, Ron.
Bien, tomen
¿Cómo
asiento.
están?
En verdad eran similares. Los investigadores ahora tenían el rostro del supuesto asesino en serie. Los investigadores estaban a la casa de un asesino en serie que había asesinado a 2 jóvenes afroamericanos en Cincinnati y a 2 más en Salt Lake City. Ahora tenían un retrato de su sospechoso, pero el detective a cargo, Don Bell, aún no tenía un nombre, ni evidencia sólida que lo conectara con los asesinatos.
Manos a la obra.
No teníamos nada para acusarlo, sin embargo ubicamos un motel donde se alojó aquí en Salt Lake City por 2 noches. Como se fue sin pagar, de inmediato solicitamos una orden de arresto que nos fue otorgada y lo acusamos de estafar un posadero por no pagarle. Emitimos esa orden bajo cada nombre que habíamos encontrado en las tarjetas de registro de todos los moteles.
Sí, eso es.
El FBI ingresó la orden, la matrícula y todos sus alias en el CNIC, Centro Nacional de Información Criminal, una base de datos informática que vincula más de 57,000 despachos legales en todo el país. El 25 de septiembre de 1980, más de un mes después de los asesinatos en Salt Lake City, la base de datos del FBI dio resultados. Cuando unos oficiales del condado de Boone, Kentucky, llegaron a un motel local para arrestar a un par de ladrones de joyas, el gerente les dijo que uno de sus clientes se quejaba de las luces y el ruido de sus vehículos.
7 o 8 patrullas en el estacionamiento con las luces encendidas y las radios a todo volumen, y una persona que estaba en el motel se molestó por todo el ruido y llamó a la oficina del gerente y le dijo qué estaban haciendo los policías allí. ¿Por qué hacen tanto ruido? Voy a irme si no se callan. Entonces el gerente salió y se acercó a uno de los oficiales del condado de Boone y le dijo, hay un inquilino muy molesto por el ruido que están haciendo.
Cuando el sargento preguntó quién se quejaba, el gerente nocturno le dijo que las llamadas provenían de la habitación 80. Intrigado, el sargento cotejó la matrícula registrada del Camaro con el hombre en esa habitación. El resultado de la computadora vinculada a la base de datos del FBI arrojó la orden de arresto de Utah. Los oficiales del condado de Boone fueron a la habitación 80, Un hombre esbelto y blanco con acento sureño abrió la puerta. En el interior, los oficiales vieron 2 escopetas en la cama. Lo esposaron y se lo llevaron para interrogarlo. Esta vez el fugitivo se registró con su nombre real, Joseph Paul Franklin. Notificaron a los investigadores de Salt Lake City que tenían a su hombre. El detective Bell y su colega salieron en el siguiente avión a Kentucky. Pero cuando llegaron, el alguacil del condado de Boone les tenía noticias alarmantes. El fugitivo había escapado de su celda de resguardo.
En algún momento del interrogatorio, el detective dejó la habitación un momento para buscar algo de beber para el sujeto y para él mismo. Y fue ese el momento que este individuo aprovechó para intentar escapar por la ventana, lográndolo.
Los investigadores aún tenían su Camaro, sus armas y su billetera, que contenía su licencia de conducir y su foto. El detective Bell de Salt Lake City recordó lo parecida que era su foto a los 2 retratos.
Ver esa licencia fue casi espeluznante. Casi parecía que el retrato que se había hecho en Kentucky y el que hicimos aquí en Salt Lake City los habíamos realizado con la licencia de conducir de Joseph Paul Franklin.
Pero el presunto asesino en serie aún les llevaba la delantera.
¿Ustedes creen?
El FBI emitió una orden federal por vuelo ilegal para eludir enjuiciamiento. Los investigadores esperaban que las acciones del FBI pudieran detener al asesino antes de que atacara de nuevo. El rostro y la descripción del fugitivo inundaron los medios de comunicación a nivel nacional. El agente Jensen encabezó la cacería del FBI.
Casi de inmediato fue incluido en la lista de los 10 más buscados por su notoriedad y debido a la gravedad del crimen. Por el hecho de que era sospechoso no solo en este crimen, sino en el asesinato de varios hombres negros a lo largo de Estados Unidos. Estos eran casos que no se habían resuelto.
Para entrar en la lista de los fugitivos más buscados, el archivo de Franklin fue seleccionado entre muchos otros. Agentes especiales en la sede del FBI eligen a los 10 más buscados por el peligro inmediato que un sospechoso representa para la sociedad, porque el sospechoso no dejará de matar hasta que lo atrapen. La noticia de la fuga del asesino trajo consigo una ráfaga de avistamientos, incluido uno de un adolescente de Kentucky. Él le dijo que un hombre le había ofrecido $100 para llevarlo al otro lado del río, a un centro comercial en Cincinnati. Los investigadores se reunieron en el centro comercial para entrevistar a cualquiera que pensara que lo había visto. Descubrieron que el supuesto asesino en serie había comprado ropa nueva y le habían cortado y teñido el pelo.
¿En el tope o algo más suave?
Franklin había cambiado su apariencia y aún tenía algo de dinero. Al regresar a Kentucky, los técnicos forenses revisaron el Camaro en busca de pistas. Tomaron fotos de sus neumáticos, esperando que coincidieran con las huellas encontradas cerca de la escena del crimen en Salt Lake City. Y coincidieron. Para el detective Bell fue un gran avance.
Los neumáticos eran una especie de prototipo nuevo que solo se vendió al este de Mississippi. Así que para que los neumáticos aparecieran en un terreno en Salt Lake City, tendrían que haber sido comprados en ese momento al este del Mississippi. Eso ubicó a ese auto y a ese hombre en nuestra ciudad.
En el laboratorio de balística del FBI en Washington, D.C., los examinadores analizaron las armas que Franklin había dejado en el auto. Esperaban determinar si una de las armas era el arma homicida.
Tenía 2 rifles y 2 revólveres. El FBI pudo comparar la balística de estas armas con las balas que se recuperaron de los cuerpos de las víctimas, pero no coincidieron.
El FBI también buscó en su base de datos posibles registros criminales y órdenes de arresto pendientes para Joseph Paul Franklin. Descubrieron que Franklin había cambiado su nombre legalmente.
Tengo más información.
¿Qué averiguaste?
Su nombre de nacimiento era James Clayton Vaux. La información permitió a los investigadores profundizar mucho más en su pasado.
Sí.
Joseph Paul Franklin, un presunto asesino en serie de hombres afroamericanos, había escapado de la policía en Kentucky y seguía huyendo. El FBI había determinado que él ya había cambiado su nombre por James Clayton Boone.
No sé si se puede añadir algo más.
Agentes y detectives locales rastrearon su historia hasta su ciudad natal en Beardtown, Alabama. Hablaron con personas que lo conocieron. Para el detective de Cincinnati, Mike O'Brien, una imagen más clara del fugitivo comenzó a surgir.
Beardtown es descrita como una ciudad donde en esencia un lado de la calle es negro y el otro lado es blanco. Por lo tanto, hubo mucha tensión racial en su educación. Hubo muchos problemas entre blancos y negros en esa área. Su madre tenía parientes que habían estado en la Segunda Guerra Mundial del lado de Alemania nazi. Franklin en un momento había dicho que había leído a Mein Kampf y había quedado muy impresionado con ese libro.
Joseph Paul Franklin había escogido su nuevo nombre para honrar a uno de sus héroes, el jefe de propaganda de Hitler, Paul Joseph Goebbels.
Este fue el día...
El FBI rastreó sus movimientos durante el año anterior y descubrió que coincidían con varios robos bancarios sin resolver.
Es él. Sí, es él.
Los agentes también encontraron que 2 años antes había enviado una carta amenazando con matar al presidente Jimmy Carter debido a sus opiniones pro derechos civiles.
Dedicaré mi presidencia...
El presidente estaba haciendo campaña en el sur donde Franklin había sido visto por última vez. La elección estaba a solo unas semanas de distancia. Si Franklin iba a cumplir su amenaza sería pronto. El detective Bell recuerda que el FBI y el servicio secreto entraron en acción.
Decidieron que Joseph Paul Franklin, también James Clayton Boone, en definitiva era una amenaza para el presidente Carter, ya que había escrito diciendo que le gustaría matarlo, así que expusieron fotos de Joseph Paul Franklin en cada ciudad que el presidente iba a visitar.
El FBI tenía que atrapar a Franklin antes de que Franklin se acercara al presidente.
Al poder contactar a sus amigos, logramos determinar que durante esta etapa de su vida estaba vendiendo plasma sanguíneo para obtener dinero y vivir. Como resultado de eso, al instante enviamos boletines a todos los centros de plasma sanguíneo al sureste de Estados Unidos.
Las clínicas de todo el sur recibieron sobres del FBI con información sobre el asesino, ahora sospechoso de asesinato en al menos 7 estados.
Señorita Jackson, ¿está bien?
Me siento muy mareada.
De acuerdo, recuéstese por un minuto. En solo unos minutos usted verá que...
El 28 de octubre, Franklin entró en una clínica del área de Tampa para vender su plasma.
Sí, estoy un
El
poco...
enfermero que lo estaba esperando reconoció los tatuajes del sobre enviado por el FBI, la muerte y el águila norteamericana.
¿Es la primera vez que donas sangre?
Oh, santo cielo, estoy tan mareada. Sí.
Franklin pensó que para un hombre que huía, vender su sangre era algo más seguro que robar.
Va a estar bien. Yo lo hago siempre.
Él estaba equivocado. El enfermero llamó al número que el FBI había dado.
Muy bien, de acuerdo. Sí, lo mantendré ocupado.
Los agentes federales rodearon la clínica y lograron arrestar a Franklin. Esta vez no se cometerían errores.
Usted tiene derecho.
El asesino se entregó en silencio, sin resistir. Franklin fue llevado a Salt Lake City para ser juzgado por los asesinatos de Ted Fields y David Martin.
¿Puedo beber algo?
Pero el detective Bell de pronto encontró todo el caso de homicidios bajo riesgo.
El fiscal del condado no consideró que tuviéramos un caso muy sólido en lo que a él concernía. Toda la evidencia era solo circunstancial y no estaba dispuesto a ir a la corte solo por un caso puramente circunstancial. Pero el gobierno federal, a través del FBI, esta vez decidió intervenir ya que sentían que tenían un caso muy fuerte y sólido en su contra, basándose en sus violaciones a los derechos civiles.
Una condena por los derechos civiles tenía sus propios obstáculos. Los fiscales tendrían que demostrar no solo que él había cometido los homicidios en Utah, sino que estaba motivado por el odio racial. El FBI tenía el presunto asesino en serie Joseph Paul Franklin en Salt Lake City, mientras los fiscales federales construían un caso para demostrar que sus asesinatos tenían motivos raciales. Los agentes federales entrevistaron de nuevo a sus amigos, familiares y a 2 ex esposas para tener una idea más clara de las creencias raciales de Franklin. El agente Jensen envió a su equipo a la ciudad natal de Franklin, Burton, Alabama.
Decidimos ir y entrevistar a personas que lo conocían y pudimos construir una historia sobre él, si se quiere, de cómo era él, el hecho de que había sido asociado con el Ku Klux Klan, que había estado asociado con el partido nazi estadounidense, y el hecho de que había sido arrestado varias veces por conducta desordenada y en algunos casos por posesión de un arma.
Los fiscales persuadieron a testigos que podrían declarar sobre el paradero de Franklin y sus opiniones racistas. En un motel, un gerente accedió a hablar en el juicio sobre su encuentro con Franklin.
La policía había ubicado un motel donde se había quedado antes de que ocurriera el tiroteo. Y él se registró en la oficina y luego fue a la habitación. Tiró de las mantas y encontró un cabello negro en la cama. Esto lo molestó mucho. Se puso furioso, fue a la oficina, exclamó y gritó, e hizo una serie de declaraciones raciales contra la gente negra.
A donde quiera que iban, los investigadores encontraban testigos que recordaban el auto de Franklin. El fiscal federal adjunto, Steve Snarr, recuerda que el Camaro de Franklin resultó crucial para su caso.
El auto que el señor Franklin conducía era único, tenía un color único. Tenía bandas rojas que eran del tipo de rayas personalizadas. También tenía características interiores únicas y neumáticos no estándar, y otras que no fueron percibidas por los testigos que vieron el auto en el área de Salt Lake.
Y él...
El equipo de investigación también entrevistó a 2 mujeres jóvenes que se habían subido al Camaro de Franklin.
Sí, él estaba muy desaliñado.
Encontramos 2 mujeres, una de ellas llamada Sandra y otra llamada Rhonda, que dijeron que entre las 4, 4:30 y 5 menos cuarto, el día del asesinato, estaban haciendo autostop a un par de cuadras del parque. Este hombre del Camaro las recogió. Tenían que llegar al banco del centro para depositar su cheque antes de que cerrara a las 5.
Cuando subieron al auto, Franklin les preguntó si había gente negra en el parque. Una de las jóvenes que estaba saliendo con un hombre negro dijo que sí. Antes de dejarlas, les entregó tarjetas impresas que decían «Quítate la ropa». Bell envió las tarjetas al laboratorio del FBI y los técnicos forenses pudieron conectarlas de manera concluyente con tarjetas similares encontradas en la guantera del Camaro de Franklin. La hora de la historia de las mujeres también fue determinante.
Además, lo vieron de nuevo esa noche, a una cuadra y media del parque a las 8:30. Poco a poco pudimos ubicarlo en el parque a la misma hora que las víctimas.
Relación.
Quiero que me ayudes.
Le dijo a él, le confesó a Herrera que había disparado a los 2 corredores en Salt Lake City. Y también confesó haber cometido un homicidio en la ciudad de Oklahoma.
Herrera solicitó una reunión con el FBI y los investigadores del lugar. Tenía una propuesta que hacerles.
¿Cómo va todo?
Herrera se convertiría en un testigo federal contra Franklin si el Estado le garantizaba una liberación temprana. Franklin le dijo a Herrera por qué disparó a las parejas en Liberty Park. Dijo que creía que las personas de diferentes razas nunca deberían mezclarse. Cuando Franklin vio a los hombres negros que caminaban con chicas blancas en el parque, sintió que debían morir.
Me alegra que pudieran lograrlo.
Los investigadores no estaban muy convencidos de confiar en Herrera.
Lo que quieran.
La confesión de un detenido no aseguraba un juicio exitoso.
Espera, tenemos solo un teléfono, 2 personas. Tenemos que hablar, tenemos que coordinarnos aquí también.
Cuando los investigadores solicitaron más información, Herrera les contó sobre el paradero de Franklin luego de los asesinatos en Salt Lake City.
Bien, puedo decirles lo que hizo después de los disparos. Él hizo los disparos, se fue de aquí, fue a una ciudad al norte de Salt Lake City, Ogden. Tomó la autopista a través de Nevada, a través de la montaña Winnemucca Battle en Reno, y en San Francisco vendió el rifle que mató a los jóvenes en un mercado de pulgas, fuera del área de la bahía.
Agentes e investigadores locales necesitaban confirmar la historia de Herrera. Si lograban encontrar el rifle que Franklin había usado en Liberty Park, los investigadores tendrían la pieza que les faltaba.
Es un verdadero racista.
El detective Bell envió a su equipo al mercado de pulgas a las afueras de San Francisco. Entrevistaron a traficantes de armas y otros testigos.
Recorrieron todo el mercado de las pulgas y encontraron testigos que recordaron a Joseph Paul Franklin y recordaron que estaba vendiendo armas, pero nunca pudieron encontrar el arma.
Incluso sin el arma, la historia de Herrera fue confirmada. Los movimientos de Franklin después de los asesinatos serían críticos para el juicio.
Bien, esta información era excelente porque nunca habíamos podido, ni el FBI había podido ser capaz de averiguar a dónde había ido el señor Franklin después de los asesinatos.
Después de que los agentes corroboraron su historia, volvieron a encontrarse con Herrera. Él les dijo a los investigadores sobre otros crímenes que Franklin le confesó. Franklin admitió haberle disparado al editor de Hustler, Larry Flint, dejándolo paralítico en 1977. Por retratar a hombres negros con mujeres blancas en su revista. Franklin también le contó que le disparó a Vernon Jordan, el presidente de la Liga Nacional Urbana, en mayo de 1980. Los fiscales sintieron que tenían material suficiente para llevar a juicio este caso contra los derechos civiles.
Por lo tanto, la acusación fue un proceso complejo que involucró a 65 testigos y alrededor de 100 pruebas diferentes. Sin embargo, logramos agilizar el caso y mover las cosas al contar nuestra historia y recrear las acciones y las cosas que ocurrieron, y el juicio duró 5 días y medio hasta el final.
El jurado deliberó solo 5 horas y halló a Joseph Paul Franklin culpable de violaciones federales a los derechos civiles. El juez lo sentenció a 2 cadenas perpetuas. Franklin estaba furioso porque iría a prisión por el resto de su vida, pero aún más porque fue un fiscal afroamericano quien lo sentenció.
¡No voy a tolerar esto!
Furioso, Franklin saltó de su silla y arrojó agua sobre el abogado. Fue sometido rápidamente por los mariscales y sacado de la sala. En un interrogatorio después de su sentencia, Franklin al final admitió ante los investigadores lo que motivó los asesinatos en Utah y en todo el país.
Podría haber matado a cualquiera.
Se declaró a sí mismo como racista y que tenía un plan para asesinar a tantos negros como pudiera. Este era su propósito.
Después del exitoso juicio federal, el fiscal del condado de Salt Lake sintió que podía ganar un caso de homicidio contra Franklin. Este fue escoltado al juzgado donde pasó los últimos 2 meses durante el juicio federal. Durante un receso lo dejaron desatendido en una sala de espera. Antes de que el oficial de la corte regresara, se liberó y arrancó la puerta de sus goznes. Franklin había escapado.
Bien, sabemos que había escapado de la celda de detención, pero cuando los carceleros fueron a traerlo de vuelta a la corte antes de que llegara el jurado, él no estaba en la sala de espera.
¡Jeff!
Parecía que Joseph Paul Franklin estaba libre una vez más para continuar su camino de terror. El ascensor era su única salida y solo funcionaba con la llave de un guardia.
Simplemente no sé.
Pero el alguacil encontró el panel de control desmantelado. Franklin lo había conectado usando solo una moneda de 10 centavos y un clip.
Pudo sacar el cajetín del ascensor para prisioneros y conectar los cables y llamar al ascensor hasta ese piso y luego desapareció.
La policía cerró las calles mientras los carceleros registraban el juzgado en busca del fugitivo.
Los demás de inmediato dimos una alerta en toda la zona de que este hombre había escapado y trajimos a todos los oficiales disponibles que estaban recorriendo el área del centro de la ciudad. Al mismo tiempo, el carcelero pensó que Franklin tal vez notó que el panel arriba del ascensor se había aflojado, así que subió al techo y notó algunas huellas en el polvo y pensó que quizá de alguna forma él aún estaba en el edificio. Entonces comenzó a arrastrarse por todo el...
Sound came first, not the scream, not the sirens, but the silence that followed. A silence so dense it swallowed the Texas heat and pressed down on the town like a held breath. Because on the morning of August 14th, 1987, something was missing. and everyone felt it before they understood it. A young woman who never missed her shift, a car still warm in the parking lot, a coffee cup half full in the hood, and a community that would soon learn a new phrase, one that would echo for decades: cold case, unsolved, unanswered, unfinished. Texas was already awake when the news began to spread, not through headlines or radio alerts, but through glances, whispers, the sudden clustering of neighbors outside small houses and storefronts, because when a place is small enough, absence is louder than any alarm. And her absence was impossible to ignore. 24 years old, known by first name only, the kind of person people thought they understood simply because they saw her every day, the kind of disappearance that doesn't announce itself with violence, but with routine interrupted, with a schedule broken, with a life paused mid-sentence. Her car sat exactly where she had parked it the night before. No broken glass, no forced entry, no blood, just the faint smell of gasoline and dust, just the radio dialed to a local station still humming softly when an officer leaned in, just keys on the ground near the rear tire, not thrown, not hidden, simply dropped, as if something had made her turn suddenly, as if one unexpected second had changed everything. Police arrived expecting a misunderstanding, a missed ride, a spontaneous trip, but the hours stacked up and the day dragged on, and by nightfall the tone had shifted, voices lowered, eyes sharpened, and the word missing began to harden into something heavier, something colder, something that would soon pull in state investigators, volunteers, dogs, helicopters cutting through the dry air, their blades beating against the same question again and again. Where did she go? And how does a person vanish without leaving a mark? The town did what towns always do at first. They searched, they hoped, they prayed. They told each other stories that ended well. Stories where the missing girl walks back into view tired but alive. Stories where the explanation is simple and survivable, but the land gave nothing back. The field stretched endlessly. The back roads curled into each other like secrets, and every hour that passed without an answer tightened the grip of fear, because this was not a place where people disappeared. Not like this, not without a trace. Investigators traced her last known movements with clinical precision. The gas station camera that caught her face for 3 seconds, the cashier who remembered her smile, the co-worker who said she was quiet that night, distracted maybe, or maybe just tired. Nothing that screamed danger. Nothing that justified what followed. And yet every small detail became a potential headline in waiting. Every inconsistency a possible crack in the truth. They searched her apartment and found no sign of struggle. Clothes laid out for the next day. Groceries in the fridge. An answering machine with no urgent messages. No goodbye note. No dramatic clue. Just a life arranged to continue. A life that expected tomorrow. And that expectation was the most disturbing part, because people who plan to leave do not leave coffee half drunk or shoes by the door. People who plan to disappear do not do it in the middle of an ordinary week. By the third day, the media arrived, and with them came the language of spectacle, missing woman, mysterious disappearance, Texas town on edge. But behind the cameras the reality was quieter and worse. Exhaustion in the eyes of volunteers, maps marked and remarked. Questions repeated until they lost their shape, because every search that came up emptied deep in the silence that had settled over the case like dust. Suspicion began to move through the town the way heat moves through asphalt, slowly, invisibly, but with pressure. Glances lingered longer, conversations stopped when certain people walked by, and the investigators felt it too. That subtle shift where a missing persons case starts to tilt towards something darker, where hope becomes procedural instead of emotional, where the question changes from where is she to what happened to her. They interviewed everyone, friends, ex-boyfriends, co-workers, neighbors, men who had no reason to be remembered and women who suddenly realized how closely their lives intersected with hers. And yet every interview ended the same way, with uncertainty, with alibis that could not be disproven, with timelines that almost fit, almost made sense, but never locked into place. Then came the first strange detail. The kind that doesn't solve anything but refuses to be ignored. A witness who claimed to have seen a car idling near the parking lot around the time she vanished. A car no one could describe clearly. Not the color, not the model, only that it did not belong. Only that it waited too long. Only that it left too quickly. A shape without a name. A presence without a face. The lead went nowhere, like so many others. The car was never identified. The witness never certain. And the investigation pressed on. Driven by momentum rather than progress. Driven by the weight of expectation. Because by now the case was no longer just about her. It was about the town. About safety. About the unspoken fear that if this could happen once, it could happen again. Weeks turned into months, and the searches slowed. Not officially, not on paper, but in energy, in urgency, in the subtle cues that told everyone involved that the case was cooling, that resources were being redirected, that hope was being replaced by files and boxes and evidence tags. And when the first reporter used the phrase cold case on air, it felt less like a label and more like a sentence. Her face faded from the nightly news, replaced by new tragedies, new stories. But in Texas, in that town, nothing moved on. Her name still hung in the air, spoken carefully, as if saying it too loudly might make the truth permanent, and every anniversary reopened the same wound. Every year without answers added another layer of frustration, another layer of disbelief, because time did not make the mystery smaller, it made it heavier. Investigators revisited the evidence again and again. The keys, the car, the witness statements, the empty spaces where answers should have been. But there was nothing new to test, nothing new to compare, no body, no weapon, no confession. Just a case that refused to end and refused to begin. Suspended in uncertainty, locked in 1987, waiting for something, anything, to shift. And somewhere in all of that, unnoticed, undocumented, dismissed as irrelevant at the time, one small detail slipped quietly into storage, cataloged, filed away. A detail that did not fit the urgency of the early days. A detail that would not make sense for decades. A detail that no one thought to question, because in 1987, it looked like nothing at all. The town learned to live with the absence, but it never learned to understand it. And long after the search dogs were gone, long after the cameras left, long after the case file gathered dust, the silence remained, thick and unresolved. A constant reminder that some stories do not end when the headlines stop. Some stories just wait, patient and unfinished, for the moment when the past decides it is not done speaking. Time did not pass in that town the way it used to. It dragged, it stretched, it pressed down on every routine, until normal life felt like an imitation of itself, because when a disappearance goes unresolved long enough, it stops being an event and becomes an atmosphere. Something you breathe without realizing it. Something that shapes how doors are locked, how children are watched, how strangers are measured with the eyes before a word is spoken. The investigation officially remained open, the kind of phrase that sounds reassuring but rarely is, because open does not mean active, and active does not mean moving forward. It means waiting, revisiting, circling the same facts with newer questions that still land in the same empty spaces. And by the end of the first year, the file had grown thicker, while the answers had not. Detectives rotated in and out. Some transferred, some retired, some burned out by cases that refused to yield. And with each change came subtle fractures in continuity. A note written in shorthand only one person understood. An assumption left unquestioned. A lead deprioritized because it didn't fit the narrative forming at the time. And those fractures mattered more than anyone realized, because cold cases are not killed by a lack of evidence alone. They're killed by momentum lost inch by inch. The woman at the center of it all became a symbol. Her photograph taped to windows and bulletin boards. Her smile frozen in a time before fear. But symbols are dangerous in investigations, because they simplify what should remain complex, and as her image spread, so did speculation. Rumors hardening into theories. Theories turning into accusations whispered at diners and gas stations, where everyone knew everyone, and privacy was a fragile illusion. One name surfaced early and refused to disappear. A man loosely connected to her through work. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, just proximity. And proximity is often enough. When answers are scarce, he had been seen near the area weeks before. He had a reputation that felt wrong rather than provable, and once suspicion lands, it rarely leaves cleanly. Police questioned him multiple times, each interview yielding nothing solid. His alibi is incomplete but not false, his demeanor defensive but not incriminating, and yet the attention lingered, because in the absence of facts, tone becomes evidence, body language becomes narrative, and the case drifted dangerously close to being shaped by what felt right instead of what could be proven. Another lead pointed outward. A truck spotted on a nearby highway. Plates partially remembered. Driver unidentified. But the trail dissolved almost immediately, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of similar vehicles, by memories distorted by time and fear, by the reality that highways swallow evidence faster than crime scenes ever could. The investigators returned to the parking lot again and again, measuring distances, reimagining movements, replaying the last known seconds of a routine, as if repetition alone might reveal something new. But the space remained stubbornly ordinary. No hidden corners. No blind spots that explained how someone could vanish without resistance, without noise, without a trace, and that ordinariness was unsettling because it suggested planning or familiarity, or something even worse, opportunity disguised as normalcy. As months slipped into years, the case entered its second life, the archival life, boxes labeled and shelved, evidence sealed in plastic and paper, logs printed and stored, and within that process, something subtle happened. The urgency of context faded. Details lost their emotional weight. A coffee cup became an object. Keys became inventory. A timeline became numbers instead of moments. And when that transformation occurs, mistakes become easier to make. The community changed. Businesses closed. Families moved. New residents arrived who knew the story only in fragments. And with each passing year, the case grew older than some of the people now living there. A strange inversion where the mystery outlived its immediate witnesses, where memory itself became unreliable. Every anniversary brought renewed attention, brief surges of interest followed by inevitable decline. A press release here, a candlelight vigil there, but no breakthrough, no revelation, and the word cold attached itself permanently to the file, not as a status, but as an identity. Something the case could no longer escape. Inside the evidence room, among items that had not been touched in years, sat something unremarkable, something easy to overlook, something that did not scream relevance in 1987. A piece of material logged quickly, examined briefly, and then set aside, because at the time, there was no technology to make sense of it, no framework to interpret its value. And when investigators are forced to choose what matters most, the future is rarely part of that calculation. The original detectives remembered it vaguely, if at all, a footnote in a case crowded with uncertainties. And as personnel changed, even that vague memory disappeared, replaced by paperwork and secondhand summaries. Because evidence without context is just clutter, and clutter is often ignored. Years later, when new investigators reopened the file with fresh eyes and modern tools, they encountered the same walls, the same gaps, the same unanswered questions, but they also noticed something else, a pattern of assumptions repeated across decades. A story that had been told so often it had become accepted truth without ever being tested. And that realization was unsettling, because it suggested the case had not stalled due to a lack of information, but because of how that information had been interpreted. They questioned why certain leads had been dismissed, why certain witnesses had not been re-interviewed, why the focus had narrowed so quickly in the early days. And as they traced those decisions back through time, they found no malice, only haste, pressure. The human need to impose order on chaos before the chaos becomes unbearable. One investigator lingered on the inventory list longer than the others, scanning items that had not been mentioned in any recent summary, items that did not fit the dominant theory, and there it was, buried between routine entries, a small notation, brief, almost dismissive, describing an object recovered near the scene, preserved but unexplored, logged and forgotten. At first glance, it meant nothing, and that was the problem, because meaning is often invisible until the right question is asked, and in 1987, no one had known which question mattered. But now, decades later, with technology that could read traces once considered useless, the object looked different, not important yet, but possible, and in cold cases, possibility is everything. The investigator requested the item, expecting disappointment, expecting degradation, expecting the kind of anticlimax that defines so many reopened files. But when it was retrieved from storage, intact and unaltered, the room shifted subtly. Because sometimes the most dangerous evidence is not the kind that explodes with clarity, but the kind that quietly suggests the past has been lying by omission. They did not celebrate, they did not speculate openly, because experience had taught them caution, but there was a change in posture, in tone, in how the case was discussed behind closed doors, the way people speak when they sense momentum returning, when a long-dormant story threatens to wake up. The town, unaware, continued its routines, unaware that something once dismissed was about to be reconsidered, unaware that a detail written off as irrelevant might challenge everything that had been assumed, because cold cases do not announce their revival. They do not arrive with sirens or headlines. They begin quietly, in storage rooms, in files reopened, in questions finally asked the right way. And as the investigators stared at the item laid out under fluorescent light, they understood something unsettling, that the case had never truly gone cold. It had simply been waiting, patient, unresolved, for the moment when the past and the present finally collided. The object did not look like a revelation. It lay there small and unassuming, sealed in aging plastic, tagged with a date that felt almost fictional now, August 1987, a time when evidence was handled with confidence but limited foresight, when the future capabilities of science were not yet part of the investigative imagination, and that was precisely why it had survived untouched, overlooked by urgency, preserved by indifference. The investigator lifted it carefully, aware that the smallest mistake could erase whatever potential it held, aware that this case had already suffered enough from assumptions, and in that quiet room, surrounded by shelves of unresolved stories, the weight of decades pressed down. Because every cold case carries with it the knowledge that time is both enemy and accomplice, destroying some truths while protecting others. Back then, the object had been logged as incidental, something found near the parking lot, but not close enough to scream relevance, not dramatic enough to command attention, and without a clear connection to violence or struggle. It had been set aside in favor of louder clues that ultimately led nowhere, a decision that made sense in the moment and proved disastrous in hindsight. Now, under modern light, the surface told a different story. Traces invisible to 1987 eyes hinted at contact, at presence, at a moment of interaction frozen in material form, and suddenly the parking lot no longer felt empty. It felt crowded with possibilities, with movements never documented, with hands that had been there and vanished. The item was sent to a lab not with expectation, but with restraint, because cold cases punish optimism. They teach investigators to hope quietly, to wait for results without constructing conclusions. But even so, the days stretched, the silence from the lab louder than it should have been, because anticipation had re-entered the case, and anticipation is dangerous. While the analysis was underway, the investigators revisited the original timeline, not to rewrite it, but to test it against what they had always assumed, and cracks began to appear, subtle at first, then undeniable, small inconsistencies that had been smoothed over by repetition, witness statements that had been summarized rather than scrutinized, times rounded off instead of interrogated, and those cracks suggested that the disappearance might not have unfolded the way everyone believed it had. They noticed gaps where questions should have been, moments treated as transitional instead of critical, like the brief window between her leaving work and the car being found. A window so narrow it had been dismissed as unimportant because investigators believed nothing significant could happen in such a short span. A belief now exposed as a liability. The parking lot itself came back into focus, not as a static scene, but as a stage with entrances and exits, sight lines and shadows, routines and interruptions, and when reconstructed with fresh eyes, it offered something it never had before. A plausible explanation for how she could have been approached without alarm, how familiarity could have replaced force, how silence could have been mistaken for safety. This reframing disturbed some long-held conclusions, especially regarding the primary suspect who had absorbed so much attention early on, because when the timeline was adjusted even slightly, his presence no longer aligned as neatly as it once had. And that misalignment mattered, because it meant the investigation may have narrowed too quickly, closing doors before they were fully explored. The lab results arrived without ceremony, a report emailed rather than delivered in person, a mundane format for something that had the potential to change everything, and the investigator read it slowly, twice, then a third time, not because it was unclear, but because its implications were heavy. The object contained trace material that could not belong to her, material that suggested contact with another individual, preserved just well enough to survive decades of storage. It was not a name, not yet, but it was a direction, a confirmation that someone else had been there, someone close enough to leave something behind, and that confirmation electrified the case quietly, because cold cases do not erupt, they shift, they tilt. They begin to move after years of stillness, and movement is felt more than seen. The investigators resisted the urge to rush, to announce, to reframe publicly, because premature exposure had damaged cases before, and instead they worked backward, mapping the trace against known individuals, known associates, known visitors to the area, a process painstaking and slow, because databases were incomplete, records outdated, and many of the people who might have mattered were now scattered, changed, or gone. They reopened interviews with surviving witnesses, careful not to contaminate memory with new information, careful not to impose significance retroactively. But time had done its own damage, recollection softened, details blurred, confidence replaced accuracy, and yet, in those conversations, patterns emerged. Things once dismissed resurfaced when viewed through the lens of contact rather than abduction. One witness hesitated longer than the others, paused at questions about the parking lot, about unfamiliar faces, about moments that felt wrong but not threatening enough to report. And hesitation is a language investigators learn to read fluently, because it often signals not deception but regret. The realization that something remembered too late might have mattered. The witness spoke of a man standing near the edge of the lot that night, not lurking, not hiding, just present, as if waiting for someone, his demeanor casual, his posture relaxed, and at the time it had seemed insignificant, another face in a familiar place, but now that memory took on new weight. Because casual presence is often how opportunity disguises itself. No one had pressed for details then. No one had asked for a description precise enough to matter. And now the witness struggled to reconstruct what had never been properly recorded, a failure that belonged not to memory, but to process, because investigations depend not just on what people see, but on what they're asked to notice. The name of the man was unknown, but the behavior fit a pattern the investigators had begun to recognize. Someone who blended into routine, someone whose presence would not trigger alarm, someone who could approach without resistance. And that realization challenged the image of a violent stranger snatching a victim into the dark, replacing it with something quieter and more unsettling. As the theory evolved, so did the pressure, because reinterpreting a case after decades invites scrutiny, invites criticism, invites the possibility that mistakes were made early on that can never be corrected. And that weight hung over every meeting, every note, every decision to pursue one path instead of another. The town remained unaware of these shifts, still carrying the old version of the story, still anchored to familiar suspicions. And the distance between public perception and investigative reality widened, a dangerous gap where rumors thrive and trust erodes. Because when cold cases move without explanation, they can feel like betrayals to those who have lived with them the longest. The investigators knew that if they were wrong, the consequences would be severe. Renewed hope crushed again, credibility damaged, grief reopened without resolution. But they also knew that doing nothing would guarantee the case remained frozen forever, and so they continued. Guided by evidence rather than comfort, by possibility rather than certainty, they expanded their search beyond the original circle, looking at people who had passed through town temporarily, seasonal workers, contractors, drivers, men whose names never made into the file because no one thought to ask, and that expansion felt overdue. Like turning on a light in a room that had been searched in the dark for years. Records were incomplete, some lost, some never digitized, some destroyed by time and neglect, but fragments remained, enough to suggest that someone fitting the witness's vague description had been in the area, enough to hint at movement through the town around the time of the disappearance, enough to keep the case from slipping back into stasis. As nights grew longer for the investigative team, as files stayed open on desks past closing hours, the case began to assert itself again, not as history, but as an active presence, a reminder that unresolved violence does not fade, it waits. And the closer they came to understanding how the disappearance unfolded, the more disturbing the unanswered question became. Not who took her, but how easily it happened. Because the most unsettling truth emerging from the reevaluation was not about brutality or force, it was about normalcy, about how ordinary the circumstances might have seemed, about how little deviation from routine was required for everything to go wrong. And that realization haunted the investigators as they pushed forward, aware that the past was no longer silent, and it was not done revealing itself. The first name did not arrive like a confession or a revelation. It surfaced quietly, almost reluctantly, pulled from old employment logs and half-forgotten records. A man who had passed through the town in the late summer of 1987. Not a resident, not a stranger either, someone temporary, someone forgettable. And that forgettability was precisely what made him dangerous to the integrity of the original investigation. He had worked nearby, for a short time, a job that placed him close enough to routine spaces to blend in, close enough to be seen without being noticed, and when investigators overlaid his presence onto the reconstructed timeline, the alignment was unsettling, not perfect, not conclusive, but plausible in a way the old theories no longer were. There was no dramatic criminal history attached to his name, no record that would have triggered alarm bells in 1987, just minor fences, transit work, gaps in residence, the kind of profile that slips easily through early investigative filters because it lacks obvious menace, and yet those gaps, once invisible, now felt deliberate, spaces where context had been lost. The investigators approached carefully, because cold cases punish recklessness, and they began by tracing his movements after he left town, discovering that he had not settled anywhere long enough to leave a deep footprint, drifting through counties and states, jobs lasting months, sometimes weeks, relationships brief, connections thin, a life lived just outside the range of sustained scrutiny. They found no direct evidence linking him to the disappearance, no witness who could place him beside her conclusively, no document that proved contact. But cold cases rarely offer certainty. They offer convergence, small indicators pointing in the same direction. And here the indicators were accumulating quietly. When they interviewed people who had worked with him, years after the fact, the responses were vague but consistent, descriptions of someone polite, reserved, forgettable, someone who kept to himself, someone who watched more than he spoke, and while none of that was criminal, it reinforced the sense of someone who could exist near others without being truly known. The parking lot witness was asked to look at old photographs, not to identify, but to react, and the reaction was subtle, a pause, a tightening of focus, a hesitation that investigators recognized instantly, because certainty fades with time, but recognition often leaves a residue, an emotional response that logic cannot fully suppress. The witness did not point, did not accuse, but said something that mattered more than affirmation, that the face felt familiar in the wrong way, like someone remembered without a memory attached. And in cold cases, that kind of response is as close to confirmation as time allows. Still, nothing crossed the threshold from suspicion to proof, and the investigators felt the weight of restraint, because moving too quickly could compromise the fragile structure they were building, could alert a person of interest prematurely, could contaminate what little evidence remained uncontaminated by decades of rumor. They revisited the forgotten object again, the one that had reignited the case, and ran additional tests, not because they expected miracles, but because each advancement in analysis offered another chance to narrow the field, to replace possibility with probability. And while the results were limited, they were consistent. The trace did not match her, and it did not match anyone previously scrutinized in depth. The case began to take on a new shape internally, less about a violent interruption and more about a controlled encounter, something that escalated from normal interaction into irreversible consequence. And that shift reframed everything: the lack of noise, the absence of witnesses, the speed with which she disappeared. None of it required force if trust or familiarity had been leveraged. This reframing made some investigators uncomfortable, because it suggested the original assumptions had been shaped by cultural expectations rather than evidence. The belief that danger announces itself, that predators look a certain way, that violence leaves obvious marks. And the case now argued the opposite, that harm can arrive quietly, wrapped in normalcy. As internal confidence grew, so did external pressure, because cold cases, once stirred, attract attention, journalists sensed movement, inquiries increased, and the department faced a choice: stay silent and risk speculation, or acknowledge progress without compromising the investigation. A balance that is almost impossible to maintain. They chose silence, and silence breeds suspicion, especially in communities that have lived with unanswered questions for decades. And soon rumors resurfaced. Old names dragged back into conversation, accusations recycled, and the distance between what investigators knew and what the public believed widened again. The family, still present, still waiting, was informed carefully, not of conclusions, but of effort, of renewed focus, of the possibility that the case was no longer dormant, and that possibility carried its own cruelty, because hope after decades is sharper than despair. It cuts deeper when it fails. The investigators felt their responsibility acutely. Every decision weighed against its impact on people who had already endured too much uncertainty. But the case demanded progress, not comfort, and progress often feels cruel before it feels just. They attempted to locate the man again, discovering that time had eroded his trail further, records incomplete, addresses outdated, some databases yielding nothing at all, and the possibility loomed that he might be unreachable, deceased, or simply beyond the reach of confirmation. A reality that haunts cold cases, where suspects can outlive accountability. When they finally narrowed down a possible current location, it was provisional, uncertain, built on fragments rather than facts, and yet it was enough to justify a quiet inquiry, enough to test whether the past could still be confronted. As they prepared to make contact, the investigators understood the stakes, that this encounter, if mishandled, could close doors forever, that a single misstep could turn a person of interest into an uncooperative shadow, and so they planned meticulously, questions drafted, strategies debated, restraint emphasized. But even before the contact was made, something shifted again, something unexpected, because in the process of tracing his movements, they uncovered another detail, small but troubling, another location, another disappearance, years later. Geographically distant but disturbingly similar in its quietness, its lack of witnesses, its abrupt erasure of routine. The connection was tenuous, not enough to present publicly, not enough to pursue formally, but enough to unsettle the investigators, because patterns once glimpsed are hard to ignore, and the idea that this case might not be isolated, that it might be part of something larger, darker, more systematic, pressed heavily on every subsequent decision. The past was no longer just unresolved. It was threatening to expand, to implicate more than one moment, more than one victim. And as the investigators moved closer to the man whose name had surfaced from the margins of history, they did so with the understanding that answers, if they came, would not be simple, and that some truths, once uncovered, refused to stay contained. The contact did not begin with handcuffs or flashing lights. It began with a knock that sounded ordinary enough to be ignored, a sound that carried no accusation in it, no weight of history, just a request for conversation delivered decades too late. And when the door finally opened, the past stood there altered but unmistakably present. The man was older now, his face rearranged by time rather than guilt, hair thinner, posture slower, the kind of transformation that makes memory unreliable, because people expect monsters to age into something obvious, something visible, but he looked like countless others, indistinct, unremarkable, and that ordinariness was disarming in its own way. The investigators introduced themselves without naming the case, because strategy in cold cases is built on patience, on letting the subject reveal what they remember before they are told what matters. And his reaction was measured, cautious, polite. The response of someone accustomed to keeping his life segmented, answering only what is asked, nothing more. They spoke first about work, about places he had lived, about the late 1980s in Texas. And as the conversation drifted backward through time, subtle changes appeared, hesitations where none were necessary, corrections offered too quickly, details volunteered before questions were finished, behaviors that do not prove guilt but suggest vigilance, the constant monitoring of one's own words. When they mentioned the town, his eyes flickered just long enough to register recognition before neutrality returned. A moment so brief it could have been dismissed, but investigators are trained to live inside such moments, to catalog them, to weigh them against everything else that is said and unsaid. He remembered the job, remembered the area, remembered little else, a convenient erosion of detail that time often provides. But selective memory is its own kind of narrative, because some things fade naturally while others are actively avoided. And the investigators noted which questions produced immediate answers, and which dissolved into vagueness. They did not accuse. They did not confront. They listened, because in cases like this, pressure too early can collapse the structure before it is understood. And as the conversation continued, it became clear that he had anticipated this moment, not recently, not in response to renewed investigation, but long ago, because his explanations sounded practiced, smoothed by repetition, as if rehearsed in private for years without an audience. He denied knowing her, denied being in the parking lot that night, denied anything beyond coincidence, and denial itself was expected, but the way it was delivered mattered, calm, steady, almost relieved, as if the conversation had finally aligned with a script he had prepared for decades. The investigators left without resolution, without escalation, because the purpose of the first contact was never confession, it was calibration, understanding how he responded to the idea of the past being reopened, and what they learned unsettled them. Because he did not react like someone surprised by attention, he reacted like someone managing it. Back at the department, they compared notes, dissected phrases, tones, pauses, building a profile not from accusation but from observation. And the consensus was cautious but clear. He had been waiting for this knock, perhaps not today, perhaps not this year, but eventually. And that expectation suggested awareness, not necessarily guilt, but consciousness of proximity to something unresolved. They sought corroboration, looking for records that could place him elsewhere on the night of the disappearance. But the further back they reached, the thinner the documentation became, time erasing what certainty might have existed, leaving behind only contradictions and absences. the worst terrain for investigators seeking proof. Meanwhile, the lab work continued quietly. Additional testing pushed to the limits of what the preserved material could yield, each process risking degradation, but offering the chance for specificity. And when partial results came back, they sharpened the picture just enough to be unsettling, narrowing the range of possible contributors without naming one. The investigators considered confronting him with this information but resisted, because revealing evidence prematurely can teach a suspect how to adapt, how to refine denial, how to anticipate future questions. And this case had already been shaped too much by early missteps. The pressure mounted internally because momentum had returned but certainty had not. And cold cases at this stage are dangerous, balanced between progress and collapse, where one wrong decision can freeze them forever again. Outside the department, whispers grew louder. Someone had been contacted, someone had been questioned, and speculation raced ahead of facts, as it always does, pulling the community back into the gravitational field of a case they had learned to carry without answers. The family sensed the shift immediately. Hope and fear braided tightly together, because renewed investigation brings visibility, and visibility brings exposure. And exposure can either illuminate the truth or distort it beyond recognition. The investigators met with them again, careful with language, careful with promises, explaining that contact had been made, that the case was active, that nothing was resolved, and those careful words landed with mixed weight, because after decades, ambiguity is both familiar and unbearable. As weeks passed, surveillance yielded nothing actionable. The man's routine steady, controlled, unremarkable, no slips, no confessions whispered to friends, no sudden movements that suggested panic, and that steadiness was itself unnerving, because guilt does not always produce chaos. Sometimes it produces discipline. Then another development surfaced quietly, not from the man, but from the past. A report from a neighboring jurisdiction revisited in light of the Texas case, describing a disappearance with unsettling similarities. Same era, same quiet approach, same absence of force, same erasure of routine. And suddenly the case expanded again, stretching beyond its original borders. The connection remained unofficial, speculative, but the investigators could not ignore the convergence, because patterns are rarely obvious until hindsight arranges them, and once arranged, they demand attention. They understood now that confronting him again would not be enough, that the case required something stronger, something that could break through decades of practiced denial, and that meant waiting, gathering, aligning evidence until the moment could not be deflected. But waiting carries its own cost, because every day that passed allowed the past to recede further, allowed memories to fade, allowed opportunities to close, and the investigators felt the tension acutely, caught between the need for patience and the fear of losing what little momentum they had regained. As they stood at that threshold, unsure whether the case was moving toward resolution or another dead end, one truth became unavoidable: that whatever had happened in that parking lot in 1987 was not an impulsive act, not a momentary lapse, but something controlled, something deliberate, something that had been carried quietly through time by someone who understood how to disappear without leaving himself behind. And that realization reframed everything, because if the disappearance was planned, then the silence that followed was not accidental, it was maintained. And breaking that silence would require more than questions. It would require the past to be cornered by its own evidence. The case no longer felt dormant, it felt restless, as if decades of silence had been disturbed and the past was pushing back, resisting containment, because every new comparison, every parallel drawn to another disappearance, widened the scope of what investigators were now obligated to confront. They assembled timelines side by side, Texas 1987 and the later case from the neighboring jurisdiction, aligning dates, locations, behaviors, and what emerged was not a mirror, but a rhyme, subtle similarities that would mean nothing on their own, but together suggested repetition rather than coincidence, the same quiet approach, the same absence of witnesses, the same sudden removal from routine without evidence of struggle. This reframing forced a difficult acknowledgement that the Texas disappearance might not have been an isolated failure of circumstance, but an early instance of something that continued unchecked, and that possibility carried enormous weight, because it implied missed opportunities. Lives altered or lost while the truth remained buried. The investigators coordinated discreetly with other agencies, sharing limited information, careful not to contaminate parallel investigations, careful not to overstate connections that could collapse under scrutiny. But the conversations themselves marked a turning point. Because cold cases rarely expand outward, they usually contract, narrowing toward a single narrative. An expansion suggested unresolved complexity rather than clarity. Scientific advances continue to press forward. The preserved trace reanalyzed using methods unavailable even a decade earlier, yielding incremental refinement rather than dramatic revelation. But in cold cases, refinement is power. It eliminates uncertainty. It sharpens focus. It turns broad suspicion into directed inquiry. And the field narrowed again, slowly but unmistakably. The investigators returned to the man, not in person, not yet, but on paper, dissecting his life with new precision, mapping movements, identifying overlaps, isolating periods where documentation vanished entirely. And those absences aligned too neatly with the timelines of interest to be dismissed as coincidence. They noticed how often he placed himself in transitional environments, temporary work sites, peripheral housing, spaces where people pass through without deep connection, environments that offer both access and anonymity. And that pattern, once seen, refused to fade. Because it explained not just opportunity, but longevity, how someone could remain adjacent to harm without drawing attention. Still, nothing rose to the level of arrest, and that restraint frustrated everyone involved, because momentum without conclusion is exhausting, but restraint was necessary, because cold cases collapse when investigators try to force closure before the structure can hold it. The media pressure intensified, leaks inevitable despite precautions, headlines speculative, language careless, and the department found itself managing not just an investigation, but perception, correcting misinformation, while protecting the integrity of what little evidence remained untainted by public narrative. The family, again caught in the crosscurrent, endured renewed exposure, interviews requested, old photographs circulated, their private grief made public once more, and the investigators felt the ethical tension sharply, aware that every step toward resolution demanded something from people who had already given too much. Behind closed doors, debates sharpened, whether to confront the man again with stronger language, whether to seek warrants based on convergence rather than proof, whether to risk pushing too hard and losing cooperation entirely. And these debates were not academic. They carried consequences that could define the case's fate. What tipped the balance was not science or speculation, but something quieter. A document unearthed from an old file in another jurisdiction, a report that had never been digitized, never cross-referenced, because no one had known to look. A report describing an encounter that stopped short of disappearance. A woman approached, engaged, unsettled, but ultimately released, an incident dismissed at the time as benign. The description of the man in that report was incomplete, vague, but the behavior aligned too closely to ignore. The same casual presence, the same conversational opening, the same attempt to establish trust before escalation, and that near miss reframed the entire pattern, because it suggested choice, selection, moments where harm could have occurred but did not, moments that revealed control rather than impulse. This was the first indication that someone might have survived an encounter long enough to remember it. And memory, unlike trace evidence, speaks, even decades later, if it can be located. The investigators tracked down the woman, now older, her life long since moved beyond that brief, unsettling moment, and when they contacted her, the past resurfaced with surprising clarity, because fear has a way of preserving detail, and as she spoke, The room grew quiet, because her account filled gaps no forensic process could. She described the approach, the tone, the familiarity that felt forced, the moment when instinct overrode politeness, and she left, shaken but unharmed, and when shown photographs, her reaction mirrored the parking lot witness from Texas. Hesitation, recognition without certainty. Emotional residue, rather than factual clarity, but residue that matters. This account changed the internal conversation completely, because it transformed the case from a single unresolved disappearance into a pattern of behavior interrupted only by chance. And that realization reframed the investigator's responsibility, not just to the past, but to preventing further harm if the pattern remained unbroken. They revisited the man's first interview with this new context, recognizing now how carefully he had managed the conversation, how he had stayed within the boundaries of denial without volunteering detail, how practiced his restraint had been, and what once seemed cautious now appeared calculated. The decision was made to re-engage, not with accusation, but with inevitability, to let the weight of converging evidence speak without revealing its full shape, to observe how he responded when the past pressed closer than before. When the second contact was arranged, the investigators understood that this was a hinge moment, that whatever happened next would either unlock the case or seal it again, and the tension was palpable, because cold cases rarely offer many second chances. They entered the conversation differently this time, more direct, more specific, referencing places, behaviors, patterns without naming conclusions, and the effect was immediate, subtle but unmistakable. The man's composure tightened, his answers shorter, his eyes tracking more carefully, as if measuring exits rather than questions. He denied again, but denial now carried friction. It required effort. It strained against the accumulating weight of implication, and that strain mattered, because it suggested that the story he had maintained for decades was under pressure for the first time. The investigators left again without arrest, without declaration, but with confirmation of something they had only suspected before, that the truth was no longer dormant, it was reacting, and reaction is the first sign that silence is failing. As they regrouped, aware that the window they were working within was narrowing, they understood that the next step would require a commitment that could not be undone, that the case was approaching a point where caution and urgency would collide, and only one could prevail. Because the past, once stirred this deeply, does not retreat quietly. It demands reckoning, and whether that reckoning would arrive through evidence, through admission, or through exposure remained uncertain. But what was clear was that the Texas 1987 cold case was no longer waiting. It was moving, and it would not stop without resistance. The third approach was never meant to be a conversation. It was designed as an environment, a carefully constructed space, where the man would be forced to sit with the weight of his own history, where silence would no longer feel neutral but accusatory, because after decades of managing the past was now crowding the room. They chose the setting deliberately, not his home, not a police station, but a neutral office, windowless, controlled, a place where time feels suspended, because in cold cases, atmosphere matters as much as evidence, and this atmosphere was built to erode comfort rather than provoke fear. From the moment he entered, something was different. The ease he had maintained before replaced by vigilance sharpened into tension, his movements economical, his gaze more deliberate, and the investigators noted it all, because pressure rarely produces confession immediately. It produces leakage. Small deviations from control that reveal where the cracks are forming. They began not with Texas, but with patterns, speaking in general terms, discussing approaches, behaviors, choices, how some individuals move through transient spaces unnoticed, how familiarity can be manufactured, how silence can be maintained not by force but by discipline. And as they spoke, they watched his reactions closely, the tightening jaw, the shifting posture, the subtle recalibration of breath. When Texas finally entered the conversation, it did so without drama, just a date, a place, a routine, and the effect was immediate, his answers slowing, words chosen with greater care, as if each one needed to pass an internal filter before being released. Because the past he had compartmentalized was no longer abstract, it had been named. They did not accuse him directly, they did not present evidence, they allowed the outline of the case to emerge naturally, a disappearance, a parking lot, a routine interrupted, and then they added something new, something he did not expect, references to other jurisdictions, other moments, other women, not details, just the acknowledgement that Texas was no longer alone. This was the moment the room shifted, because denial thrives on isolation, on the belief that an event exists in a vacuum, but patterns threaten that isolation. They suggest repetition, intent, a larger narrative, and the man reacted to that threat with visible effort, maintaining composure while tightening control. He dismissed the connections, questioned their relevance, framed coincidence as overreach, but the language he used betrayed him, because he argued not against facts, but against implications, as if he understood exactly where the conversation was heading and was determined to redirect it before arrival. The investigators let the silence stretch after his answers, long enough to become uncomfortable, because silence forces people to confront their own thoughts, and in that silence, his composure slipped just slightly, a hand clenching, a foot shifting, micro-movements that spoke louder than words. They introduced the survivor's account then, not as testimony, but as experience, describing an encounter that stopped short of disappearance, an approach that mirrored the behavior under discussion, and they watched his face carefully, because this was no longer hypothetical, it was a human memory, a voice that had lived to speak. His reaction was immediate and uncontrolled, a sharp intake of breath before he could stop it, a reflexive response that betrayed recognition before denial reasserted itself. And that moment mattered more than any statement he made afterward, because reflex is faster than strategy. He recovered quickly, too quickly, dismissing the account as mistaken, unreliable, memory distorted by time. But his tone had shifted, defensive now, urgency creeping into his words, because the story he had carried alone was no longer his to manage. The investigators pressed gently, not on guilt, but on choice, asking why someone would approach multiple women in similar ways, what drives that behavior, what satisfaction it offers. And though he deflected, the questions landed, because they forced him to engage with motive rather than denial, a terrain far more dangerous for someone who has relied on silence. As the hours passed, fatigue set in, control requires energy, and decades-old discipline begins to falter when sustained under scrutiny, and cracks appeared, not confessions, but contradictions, small shifts in timeline, slight inconsistencies in description, moments where his narrative bent under its own weight. They noted every deviation, every adjustment, building a parallel record of what changed when pressure was applied. Because cold cases are rarely solved by a single revelation, they're solved by accumulation, by the slow erosion of a story until it can no longer support itself. Still, when the interview ended, he walked out free, and that freedom weighed heavily on everyone involved, because progress without arrest feels like failure to the outside world. But internally, the investigators understood they had crossed a threshold, that the man they were watching was no longer fully in control of the narrative. In the days that followed, surveillance revealed subtle changes, routines altered, movements less predictable, phone calls made at odd hours, behaviors that suggested unease rather than panic. But unease is significant because it means the past has become active again in the present. They moved quickly now, quietly seeking warrants not for arrest, but for records, digital footprints, travel histories, anything that could corroborate or contradict the story he had told, because the next step would require something solid, something that could withstand scrutiny. When silence finally broke, what they found was not dramatic, not incriminating on its own, but consistent, gaps in his history that aligned with key moments, absences explained vaguely, records missing where others would have left traces, and that consistency mattered, because coincidence does not repeat itself this cleanly. The family was kept informed sparingly, aware that something was shifting but not yet what it meant, and that restraint was both protective and painful, because after decades, every withheld detail feels like another loss of control over a story that has defined their lives. The investigators felt the weight of that responsibility acutely, knowing that the next phase would bring exposure, that once the case crossed into public confrontation, it could never return to the careful, quiet progression they had managed so far. They debated timing, whether to wait for one more piece, one more confirmation, or to move now, while the pressure was working, because psychological momentum once built can be lost if not used, and they sensed that the man was nearing a breaking point, not collapse, but fracture. As they prepared for what came next, they understood that this was no longer just an investigation. It was a test of endurance, of whether decades of silence could withstand sustained attention, and whether truth, long suppressed, would finally assert itself. Because the most dangerous moment in a cold case is not when evidence is found, but when the person who has lived with a secret realizes that silence is no longer safe, and that realization had begun to take hold. And as the investigators closed their files that night, aware that the next steps would define the case's legacy, one thought lingered heavily, that the past, once cornered, does not negotiate. It either breaks free or breaks those who try to contain it. The shift into public daylight did not happen with an announcement. It happened with a leak, a fragment of truth escaping containment, a name spoken off record, a detail repeated too often to be coincidence, and once that door opened, it could not be closed again. Because cold cases survive on obscurity, and this one had just lost it. The first headline was cautious, vague, progress in long-running Texas cold case, but caution never lasts. Not when decades of unanswered questions have primed a community for resolution, and within hours speculation filled the gaps where facts were still absent, old theories resurrected, new ones improvised, and the man's name began to circulate, first in whispers, then aloud. Investigators watched the reaction carefully, not for validation, but for consequence, because public exposure changes behavior, it compresses time, it forces decisions, and when someone has lived comfortably inside silence, attention becomes a threat more destabilizing than accusation. The man felt it immediately. That much was clear. His routine disrupted not by police action but by perception. Neighbors watching longer, conversations cutting short when he entered a room. The subtle social isolation that signals suspicion before guilt is proven. And that isolation is powerful, because it mirrors the internal compartmentalization that has protected secrets for years, now externalized and unavoidable. He contacted an attorney within days, a move both expected and revealing, because legal counsel is not an admission of guilt, but it is an acknowledgement of risk, and risk was something he had managed to avoid for decades through obscurity alone. The investigators adjusted strategy accordingly, understanding that direct access would narrow, that every future interaction would be mediated, controlled, and that whatever leverage they intended to apply would now have to withstand legal scrutiny as well as psychological resistance. They held a press conference carefully calibrated to say little while confirming momentum, acknowledging renewed investigation without naming suspects, a delicate balance that satisfied no one fully, but maintained procedural integrity. And as microphones clustered and cameras rolled, the weight of the case shifted again, from quiet rooms and file boxes into the collective consciousness. The family stood behind the statements, their presence both grounding and painful, because they represented the human cost of every misstep, every delay, every assumption made decades earlier, and the investigators felt that presence acutely, aware that public hope is fragile and unforgiving. Behind the scenes, the case accelerated, resources allocated, analysts reassigned, interagency cooperation formalized, because once a cold case becomes active in the public eye, it demands visible progress, and progress, under pressure, is where mistakes are most likely. They revisited the forgotten object yet again, pushing analysis to its absolute limit, knowing that if it was ever going to speak clearly, it would be now or never. And when the updated report arrived, it did not deliver a name, but it delivered something else, exclusion, narrowing the field until only a handful of possibilities remained. The man's profile sat uncomfortably within that narrowed range, not conclusively, not alone, but consistently. And consistency is persuasive in ways singular facts are not, because it suggests structure, repetition, design. They saw corroboration wherever it could still exist: financial records, travel receipts, phone logs reconstructed from fragments, anything that could anchor his movements to physical reality rather than memory. And what they found was incomplete but troubling: gaps aligned with key moments, explanations offered but unsupported, a pattern of absence masquerading as coincidence. The survivor was brought back into the process carefully, her account now contextualized within a broader narrative. And though memory fades, fear preserves shape, tone, sequence, and her recollection, when overlaid with others, strengthened the behavioral profile investigators were building. This profile began to circulate internally, a composite of actions rather than identity: how he approached, how he disengaged, how he vanished, and when applied retroactively, it fit the Texas disappearance too well to ignore, explaining the silence, the lack of struggle, the speed, the absence of witnesses. The man responded to the mounting pressure with discipline, not disappearance, not flight, but containment, limiting exposure, reducing movement, relying on counsel to speak where he once spoke freely. And that restraint was telling, because innocence often demands to be heard, while control demands only survival. The investigators debated their next move intensely, whether the convergence had reached a threshold justifying arrest, or whether one more piece was needed to avoid collapse under scrutiny. Because in cold cases, premature action does not just fail, it immunizes suspects against future attempts. They chose patience, a choice that drew criticism internally and externally, because the public wanted resolution, not restraint. But the investigators understood that this case had already paid dearly for haste, and they would not repeat that mistake. As days turned into weeks, the man's environment grew smaller, his world contracting under tension. And contraction is dangerous, because it forces reckoning, either with truth or with escape, and the investigators watched for signs of either. Then something unexpected surfaced. Not evidence, not confession, but a communication, a third-party report of a conversation overheard, a remark made casually but revealingly, suggesting knowledge of details never released publicly, details only someone close to the event would know. The source was imperfect, the memory secondhand, but the content was specific enough to matter, and investigators moved quickly to validate it, cross-checking timelines, statements, press releases, and when they confirmed that the detail had indeed never been public, the case crossed another invisible line. They confronted the man's attorney with the discrepancy, not as accusation, but as question, and the response was measured, cautious, but defensive, because defense emerges most strongly when narratives begin to conflict. The man declined further interviews, his silence now explicit rather than assumed, and that silence spoke volumes, because it marked the end of cooperation and the beginning of opposition, a shift that clarified the path forward even as it complicated it. Investigators prepared their case meticulously, knowing that if they moved now, there would be no retreat, that every assumption would be challenged, every gap exploited, and the past resistance would be fierce, because secrets kept this long do not surrender quietly. The community waited, tension thick, speculation relentless, the case now a presence again rather than a memory. And in that charged atmosphere, the investigators felt the pressure of time not as an abstract concept, but as an adversary. Because momentum can carry a case forward or tear it apart, depending on how it's handled. As they finalized their strategy, one truth crystallized, that the forgotten evidence had not solved the case on its own. It had simply forced the past back into conversation, and conversation, once reopened, has a way of demanding answers. Because the silence that had protected the truth for decades was no longer empty. It was crowded, with witnesses, with patterns, with memory, with science, and the more crowded it became, the less room there was for denial to stand. The case stood now on the edge of confrontation, not yet resolution, but closer than it had ever been, and everyone involved understood that whatever came next would redefine not just the fate of one man, but the meaning of justice delayed, the cost of assumptions, and the fragile line between what is forgotten and what refuses to stay buried. The decision was not announced, it was executed, quietly at first, a series of signatures, approvals, sealed envelopes moving between offices, because when a cold case reaches this stage, sound becomes liability, and silence becomes strategy. Investigators assembled the timeline one final time, not to discover anything new, but to test endurance, to see if the structure they'd built could withstand pressure from every direction: defense, media, memory decay, and procedural ghosts from decades past. They mapped the man's life alongside the victim's final days, overlaying movements, routines, absences, coincidences that no longer felt coincidental when viewed together. And what emerged was not a single incriminating moment, but a corridor of opportunity, narrow, precise, and disturbingly consistent. The forgotten object was reintroduced as context rather than centerpiece, because reliance on one piece of evidence is how cases collapse, and this one had survived too long to be fragile now. Instead, it was used to anchor behavior, to demonstrate proximity, familiarity, access. Witnesses were re-interviewed under oath, their words sharper now, not because memory had improved, but because the stakes had, and hesitation that once seemed harmless now carried weight, pauses filled with implication, contradictions suddenly visible. One witness broke pattern, not with new information, but with a correction, a small adjustment to a statement made years earlier, insignificant on its own, but devastating in sequence, because it aligned with the man's unexplained absence at a critical hour. That correction closed a loop investigators had struggled with for years, explaining how the victim could vanish without resistance, how the scene remained clean, how time itself appeared to skip, and with that explanation came inevitability. The district attorney reviewed the file in silence, page after page, methodical, unsentimental, aware that history would not judge effort, only outcome, and when the review ended, there was no dramatic declaration, only a nod, subtle, final. An arrest warrant was authorized. Execution required choreography, not force, because the man was not dangerous in the conventional sense. He was dangerous legally, articulate, prepared, insulated, and mistakes now would be irreversible. They waited for the right moment, a routine errand, daylight, witnesses, everything documented, every step filmed, because transparency would be as important as evidence once the arrest became public. When officers approached, the man did not run, did not protest, did not ask why. He simply listened, his expression controlled, almost relieved, as if the uncertainty had finally resolved into something manageable. He asked for his attorney immediately. The booking process was clinical, fingerprints taken that had never been compared before, DNA collected under court order, not as discovery but as confirmation, because investigators already believed they knew what the results would say. The news broke within minutes, alerts flooding phones, headlines shedding restraint, decades of silence collapsing into a single word: arrest. The community reacted in waves, disbelief first, then validation, then anger, because justice delayed does not feel like justice restored. It feels like theft returned damaged. The family was notified privately before the press conference, a courtesy earned through years of patience, and their response was quiet, restrained, not celebratory, because closure is not an emotion, it is a process, and this was only the beginning. The press conference was brief, factual, no speculation, no victory language, because the system had not finished speaking, and investigators understood that public confidence is built not on certainty, but on restraint. Behind the scenes, the defense moved aggressively, filing motions, challenging admissibility, attacking the timeline, resurrecting every early misstep, as proof of contamination, and they were not wrong to try, because old cases bleed history. The prosecution anticipated this, preparing to argue not perfection, but convergence, showing how independent lines of inquiry arrived at the same conclusion without contaminating each other, how time had weakened memory but strengthened pattern. Then the lab results returned. They were not dramatic, no cinematic reveal, just confirmation, alignment, numbers matching where they were never supposed to. And in that confirmation, decades of doubt collapsed into probability, so high it bordered on certainty. The man reviewed the results with his attorney in silence. For the first time, his control slipped, not visibly, not emotionally, but structurally, his legal posture shifting from denial to mitigation, from absolute innocence to alternative interpretation, and that shift did not go unnoticed. Investigators recognized it immediately because they had seen it before, the moment when defense stops asking, "Did this happen?" and starts asking, "What can be proven?" The case entered the judicial phase, slow, grinding, public, where narrative would battle narrative, and truth would be filtered through rules designed to protect everyone, including those who have waited decades to be heard. As the man was led back to his cell that night, the weight of the past settled fully for the first time, not as memory, but as consequence, because silence no longer protected him, and obscurity was gone forever. The case that once survived on neglect now lived under scrutiny, and scrutiny has no patience for half-truths. But even now, with an arrest made and evidence aligned, investigators knew the most dangerous moment was still ahead, because trials do not seek truth, they seek proof, and proof must endure opposition. The story was not finished. It had simply crossed from investigation into judgment, where the past would finally be forced to explain itself, not to detectives, but to the world. The courtroom did not feel like a place of answers. It felt like a pressure chamber, sealed, fluorescent, every movement amplified, every silence scrutinized, because this was where decades of uncertainty would be compressed into a sequence of admissible facts. And anything that did not fit would be discarded without mercy. The defendant entered without drama, no shackles visible, no expression offered. A man framed as ordinary by design, because juries fear monsters less than they fear familiarity. Opening statements began not with emotion, but with chronology, dates spoken aloud like coordinates. Texas, summer, 1987, heat thick enough to blur memory, a young life reduced to a last confirmed sighting, and then absence, an absence that expanded year after year, untouched, unresolved. A cold case by definition and by neglect. The prosecution avoided adjectives, choosing instead to let accumulation do the work. One witness, then another, voices layered carefully so no single testimony carried the burden alone. They spoke of routine, of patterns, of the ordinary day that became extraordinary only in retrospect, because crimes like this do not announce themselves, they blend. Photographs were introduced, grainy, imperfect, but sufficient, a street corner, a vehicle, a distance measured in seconds, not miles, and the jury leaned forward not because they were convinced, but because they were beginning to see shape. The defense countered with doubt, not outrage, emphasizing time, decay, the fragility of memory, reminding the jury that certainty erodes faster than suspicion, and that the past is easily rewritten by those who revisit it with purpose. They highlighted early investigative failures, missed interviews, evidence logged without context, a system that had faltered, and they were careful not to overplay it, because attacking the system too hard risks alienating the very people empowered to judge. Then the forgotten object appeared on screen, not introduced as revelation, but as persistence, something overlooked, misplaced, surviving not because it was valued, but because it was ignored, and in that neglect it remained uncontaminated. The expert testimony was restrained, clinical, probabilities stated without drama, margins of error acknowledged openly, because confidence that admits limitation reads as honesty. The numbers did not shout, they whispered, and whispers in courtrooms travel farther than declarations. The defense attempted to fracture the connection, suggesting secondary transfer, coincidence, contamination scenarios that sounded plausible until placed against the timeline. And it was the timeline that refused to bend. A former investigator testified, older now, voice steady but eyes weighted, acknowledging mistakes without defensiveness, explaining not what they got right, but why they missed what mattered, and in doing so, transformed failure into credibility. The victim's family sat motionless, not demonstrative, their restraint louder than grief, because they had learned long ago that emotion is often dismissed where evidence is required. As days passed, the jury absorbed repetition, not redundancy, but reinforcement, each pass through the facts tightening the frame, leaving less room for alternative narratives to breathe. The defendant watched everything closely, occasionally whispering to counsel, occasionally staring past the proceedings, as if observing a story no longer under his control. When the defense presented its case, it focused on absence of direct witnesses, absence of confession, absence of certainty beyond reasonable doubt. A phrase repeated until it lost meaning and became incantation. But absence cuts both ways. The prosecution's rebuttal returned to convergence, not one piece, not one moment, but alignment across time, behavior, access, opportunity, evidence surviving despite indifference, and questions the defendant had never answered, not because he was required to, but because no alternative explanation had ever held. Closing arguments arrived without flourish. No raised voices, no appeals to fear, just a simple proposition. That time had not weakened the truth, it had protected it, allowing noise to fade while pattern remained. The jury was instructed, cautioned, released into deliberation, and the room emptied slowly, like air leaving a sealed chamber. Outside, cameras waited, headlines drafted but not published, because verdicts are not news until they are spoken. Inside the deliberation room, 12 strangers faced the weight of deciding whether history would remain unresolved or finally be defined, knowing that whatever they chose, the past would not change, only its meaning. Hours passed, then more. Questions were sent back to the judge, clarifications requested, evidence revisited, not because the jury was divided, but because they understood the permanence of conclusion. Late in the day, a note arrived. A verdict had been reached. The courtroom filled again. Breath held collectively, not in anticipation of justice, but a finality, because once spoken, the word would echo far beyond the walls, into memory, into community, into a cold case that had waited nearly 4 decades to be heard. The clerk stood. The paper was unfolded, and before the word could be read aloud, the silence itself became unbearable, stretched to its limit, a final moment where everything still existed as possibility, before collapsing into irreversible fact. The word was spoken, finally, clearly, recorded into history with a voice that did not tremble, and in that instant the room changed, not with sound, but with gravity, because verdicts do not end stories, they reframe them, forcing everyone present to recalibrate what they believe justice looks like after waiting this long. There was no outcry, no collapse, no cinematic release, only controlled reactions, restrained breaths, the defendant absorbing the sentence with a stillness that felt practiced, as if he had rehearsed this moment privately for years, preparing for an outcome he never fully believed would arrive. The family listened without visible reaction, because the verdict did not return what had been taken. It did not rewind time. It did not answer every question that had followed them through decades of holidays, empty chairs, unanswered phones. It simply placed responsibility where uncertainty had lived. Outside the courthouse, microphones crowded forward, questions sharpened into headlines, words like closure and justice deployed quickly, efficiently. But inside, among those who had lived with the case, those words felt provisional, incomplete, because closure implies an ending. And this felt more like a door finally opened onto a room no one had entered in years. The judge spoke next, formal, procedural, acknowledging the weight of time, the endurance of evidence, the obligation of the court to act not on emotion, but on proof that survives scrutiny. And with that, the legal chapter closed, even as the human one remained unfinished. The defendant was led away, slower now, not resisting, not looking back. His life reduced to paperwork and schedules of consequence, replacing the freedom of anonymity that had shielded him for decades. In the days that followed, analysis flooded media, timelines reconstructed, experts debated what could have been done sooner, how systems fail quietly, how neglect can preserve truth as easily as it can erase it, and the forgotten object became symbol rather than evidence. A reminder that answers do not always disappear. Sometimes they wait. The investigators returned to their routines, desks cleared of files that had once defined careers, knowing this case would follow them regardless, cited, studied, questioned, because solved cold cases do not rest, they instruct. The family returned home, not transformed, not healed, but steadied by certainty, because uncertainty is heavier than grief, and knowing, even late, is lighter than endless possibility. Yet some questions remained deliberately unanswered. How long suspicion had lived beneath silence, whether the truth had merely surfaced before and been dismissed, how many moments along the way could have changed everything. Questions no verdict can resolve. Years from now, the case would be referenced in training manuals, podcasts, documentaries, reduced to segments and summaries, but those who lived it would remember something else entirely. The waiting, the quiet, the years when the name of the victim faded from headlines, but never from memory. And somewhere in Texas, a community that once locked its doors a little tighter learned that the past does not stay buried simply because time passes, that cold cases are not frozen, they're patient. The story did not end with the verdict. It lingered, in court transcripts, in family photographs, in the awareness that justice, when delayed, arrives altered, heavier, carrying with it not triumph, but reflection. Because even when a case is finally spoken aloud, even when a truth is acknowledged publicly, the silence that preceded it does not vanish. It stays. A reminder that some answers come late, some scars remain open, and some stories never fully close. They simply stop asking to be solved and start asking to be remembered. What followed was not silence, but a different kind of noise, lower, constant, the background hum of a truth settling into places that had never been allowed to exist before, because once a cold case is spoken into the record, it begins to rearrange everything around it, quietly, relentlessly. Old conversations were replayed in new light, remarks once dismissed as meaningless now sounding weighted, choices reconsidered, paths not taken replayed with merciless clarity, and people who had never considered themselves involved felt the pull of responsibility, wondering what they had seen, what they had ignored, what they had explained away, because it was easier than uncertainty. The town changed subtly, not in structure, but in posture. Doors still opened, routines continued, but trust became conditional, more careful, because the case had proven something uncomfortable, that danger does not always arrive loudly, that it can live alongside familiarity for years without disturbance. Former witnesses carried the verdict like a delayed echo, relief tangled with regret, because memory, once validated, becomes heavier, not lighter, and some now wish they had insisted, spoken louder, refused to be reassured when reassurance was offered too quickly. The investigators were asked, repeatedly, what finally broke the case open, and they answered carefully, resisting the temptation to mythologize, explaining that no single moment solved it, that it was persistence, technology, timing, and the refusal to let neglect become narrative. Because cold cases rarely hinge on brilliance, they hinge on endurance. Files were reopened elsewhere, other forgotten objects re-examined, other timelines questioned, because one solved case destabilizes many unsolved ones, reminding institutions that the past is not inert, that evidence does not expire simply because attention does. The victim's name appeared again in public records, in memorials, in conversations spoken aloud rather than whispered, and in that repetition, a kind of presence returned, not the life that was lost, but the acknowledgement that it had mattered enough to be pursued until the end. Yet, even with acknowledgement, unease remained, because the case had exposed how close justice came to never arriving at all, how easily the story could have ended as a footnote, unresolved, archived, forgotten by everyone except those who carried it internally every day. The defendant adjusted to confinement, a new routine replacing the old. His world narrowed to schedules and walls, his anonymity gone, replaced by identification, a name attached permanently to a narrative that would outlive him, and in that permanence, control finally dissolved. Appeals were discussed, motions prepared, the legal system continuing its measured churn, because verdicts are not endpoints, they are stages, and the pursuit of certainty does not end simply because responsibility has been assigned. For the family, life resumed in a cautious way, not restored, not repaired, but recalibrated, the long wait replaced by a different burden, learning how to live without the question mark that had defined so much of their existence, discovering that certainty brings its own form of quiet discomfort. Anniversaries arrived differently now, no longer framed by not knowing, but by remembering, and remembering, while painful, was at least anchored, no longer floating in speculation. In training rooms and conference halls, the case was dissected, praised, criticized, used as warning and example, and through that repetition, it achieved something rare. It became instructive rather than tragic alone. Its lessons carried forward into investigations not yet imagined. But for those who had lived it, truly lived it, the case remained personal, not as a solved mystery, but as a measure of time, a reminder that truth does not move at the speed of justice, that patience can be both virtue and curse. And somewhere between resolution and regret, the story found its final shape, not as a triumph, not as redemption, but as evidence of what happens when silence is allowed to persist too long, and what it costs to finally break it. Because the real legacy of the case was not the verdict, not the sentence, not the headlines that faded as quickly as they arrived. It was the understanding left behind, that cold cases are never truly cold. They're only waiting for the moment when someone looks again, listens again, and decides that time is no longer an excuse. And once that decision is made, the past does not resist. Time did what it always does after a verdict. It moved on without permission, indifferent to meaning, but the case did not fade with it. It embedded itself, settling into places where resolution was never expected to reach, because answers, once found, have a way of unsettling more than they soothe. People began to remember differently, not because facts had changed, but because context had. Memories reframed by what was now known, moments once considered ordinary recast as warnings missed, and this retroactive clarity carried a quiet cruelty, the knowledge that signs had existed, faint but present, and that they had been easier to ignore than to confront. The town's older residents spoke less freely now, conversations pausing when the case surfaced, not out of fear of guilt, but of implication, because proximity to truth, even accidental, now felt heavier than it had before. The victim's absence took on a sharper outline, no longer a mystery softened by time, but a defined loss, edged, specific, and in that specificity, grief evolved, becoming less amorphous and more enduring, something carried rather than searched for. Law enforcement agencies beyond Texas requested briefings, interested not in the drama, but in the mechanics, how evidence survived neglect, how behavior patterns outlasted memory, how patience, when combined with restraint, succeeded where urgency had failed. The investigators obliged, but without pride, emphasizing the randomness involved, the fragile dependence on chance preservation, acknowledging openly that this outcome had balanced on a knife's edge for years. The forgotten object was returned to storage, no longer needed, its purpose fulfilled, yet it remained emblematic, a reminder that the smallest things often endure longest, unnoticed until suddenly indispensable. The The defendant's appeals advanced slowly. Predictably, arguments refined, timelines contested again, but the momentum had shifted permanently, because appeals do not rewrite convergence, they only test its limits. Inside the prison, he adjusted, not dramatically but efficiently. A man practiced in adaptation, his days stripped of complexity, reduced to repetition, and in that repetition, the long game he had unknowingly played finally ended, replaced by a finite structure he could not escape. For the family, distance from the courtroom brought an unexpected quiet, not peace, but space, room to think without anticipation, without waiting for calls, without measuring each day against possibility. They spoke of the victim more freely now, stories shared without prefacing them with uncertainty, allowing personality to exist independently of disappearance, a subtle reclaiming that felt almost rebellious after years of restraint. The case entered academic discussion, debated in seminars, framed as success and caution simultaneously, proof that justice can arrive late, and evidence that systems are never neutral. They either act or they delay, and delay has consequences measured in decades. Media interest waned as it always does, attention shifting to newer tragedies, fresher mysteries. But the story did not vanish. It settled into archives, cited when needed, dormant but intact. Those who had followed the case closely felt the absence of its presence, the strange quiet after obsession ends, a reminder that unresolved stories, however painful, provide momentum, purpose, something to chase, and their resolution leaves an unfamiliar stillness behind. The investigators felt this acutely, returning to other cases knowing that few would end this way, that most cold cases do not reward patience with answers, and that reality tempered any satisfaction they might have felt. And yet, despite the quiet, despite the fading headlines, something irreversible had occurred. A truth had been anchored, a narrative stabilized, and that stability mattered more than noise. Because even when attention